So in this lecture, we're going to do a brief history of life on Earth. And so we're going to start by talking about the geological timescale and how life marks Earth's ages. Earth's 4.6 billion years of history are measured in the geological timescale, which is divided into broad eras and shorter periods. These time frames are defined in large part by the different life forms that evolved within them, as reflected in the fossil record. So if we look at these very broad eras, we have the Cenozoic era, the Mesozoic era, and the Paleozoic era. And then within those, they can be further divided into periods. And so if we look back to the farthest back, we have our Precambrian, and that you can see at 4.6 billion years ago is the approximate beginning of Earth. And the first fossils to be found, or the oldest prokaryotic fossils, were found about 3.5 billion years ago. About 2.7 billion years ago, we started to see oxygen beginning accumulating in the atmosphere, and that ended up leading to a boom and these explosions of eukaryotic organisms. And then finally, we start to see some animals forming. And so what this is showing, you don't have to memorize this whole table. It's just to show you that in the relative span of the history of Earth, notice that the largest period of time was the Precambrian. And so notice that the most recent time is the Cenozoic era. And in the Cenozoic era, that takes up the most recent and the shortest amount of relative time span. So the history of life can be traced through fossilized life forms that are found in layers of sediment seen here in America's Grand Canyon. The older layers are going to be on the bottom and the newer layers are on the top. And so you'll remember that when we talked about relative dating, we talked about that where fossils are found can give us a relative idea of how old those fossils are. And so again, the bottom of these rock formations are going to be the older fossils and the newer ones are going to be along the top. So Earth was formed about 4.6 billion years ago. Prokaryotes evolved by about 3.5 billion years ago. Oxygen began to be produced about 2.7 billion years ago. And prokaryotes lived alone for more than 1 billion years, and they continue in great abundance today. So even today, we still have a lot of prokaryotic organisms. And so they are the oldest organisms to be on this planet, and yet they're still here today. Now, single-celled eukaryotes first evolved about 2.1 billion years ago. And multicellular eukaryotes first evolved about 1.2 billion years ago. So notice that for about 2.3 billion years, we only had single-celled organisms. We didn't really start to see the evolution of multi-celled organisms until 1.2 billion years ago. All of the major phyla of animals evolved by the end of the Cambrian explosion, which began about 540 million years ago, and it lasted about 10 million years. Plants and fungi first colonized land about 500 million years ago, and then were followed by amphibians that evolved from fish. So when you guys are studying this part of the lecture, use your study guide as far as what you need to know. You're not going to need to memorize all of these years that everything happened, but it's just to give you kind of an idea of how long ago these events occurred. So notice if we look at this, the earliest organisms, again, were prokaryotes, so bacteria and archaea, then followed by our single-celled eukaryotes like our protists, and then we start to see the evolution of multicellular eukaryotic cells, so plants, fungi, animals. And so what you need to realize too is that if you look at where the extinction of dinosaurs is, that occurred millions of years before the first humans became on Earth. And so while the Flintstones showed, animals or humans coexisting with dinosaurs, that really never happened. So life is thought to have begun on Earth about 3.8 to 3.5 billion years ago. And again, from that time until perhaps 1.2 billion years ago, all life was strictly microscopic and single-celled. And so, to judge by the fossil record, all animals and plants that exist today came about in the last 16% of life's 3.8 billion year history. And so, again, here we have when these events occurred. Prokaryotic cells, again, about 3.8 to 3.5 billion years ago. About 2.7 billion years ago, we start to see atmospheric oxygen accumulating. Then we have our single-celled eukaryotes. 1.2 billion years ago, we start to see our multi-celled eukaryotes. And then finally, we get animals and then colonization of land, followed by humans. And so if you think about this as a relative scale, notice that humans have existed for a very short time relative to Earth's history. So we're going to start by talking about how did life begin. And so life arose on Earth approximately 4 billion years ago. However, scientists know little about life's origins. Obviously, this is something that's very difficult to trace. And so again, if you look at Earth's history, origin of Earth is about 4.6 billion years ago. The origins of prokaryotic life would be about 3.8 billion years ago. One of the things that you'll notice is different places throughout textbooks will have a slightly different time frame. Notice this slide says 4.2 to 3.8 billion years ago. An earlier slide said 3.8 to 3.5. So there's quite a bit of variation because, again, when you're talking about distances that far back, it can be a little challenging to determine an actual date. About 3.7 billion years ago, we have the origin of photosynthesis. So we had, for example, cyanobacteria, which is a prokaryotic cell found in the ocean that is able to do photosynthesis. And so when we started to see the origin of photosynthesis is where we start to get oxygen in the atmosphere. And so about 2.7 billion years ago, we see eukaryotic organisms starting to originate, and we get significant oxygen in the atmosphere about 2.4 billion years ago. So how did life arise? Well, all life today arises by the reproduction of pre-existing life, or what is referred to as biogenesis. And biogenesis basically states that life comes from life. And if that's true, how could the first organisms arise? From the time of the ancient Greeks until well into the 1800s, it was commonly believed that life regularly arises from non-living matter, an idea that's referred to as spontaneous generation. This does not occur now, but it may have happened in the ancient atmosphere, which is very different from today's atmosphere. For example, when life first originated on Earth, O2 was not present in the atmosphere. However, today O2 is present, and so it's believed that while spontaneous generation cannot occur now, there have been numerous experiments to show this. It obviously is possible that at some point in evolutionary history, life had to come from somewhere. And so early times had some spontaneous generation, but in current times, biogenesis is how life forms. So scientific studies provide evidence that life originated, again, 3.5 to 4 billion years ago from non-living matter in a series of stages. And so what we have is in the early atmosphere, we have what was referred to as this primordial soup. It basically is this collection of different types of molecules. So carbon dioxide gas, hydrogen gas, water, methane, ammonia. And so these would have been these simple precursors that were present early on. Then we start to see the precursors to chemicals start to form small organic molecules. So basically, we're starting to see our monomers, our building blocks of our polymers. So we have our lipids, we have our monosaccharides, we have our nucleotides, we have our amino acids. Those are the building blocks. Then the monomers get put together to join and form polymers. So we end up with our polypeptides or our proteins. We get RNA and DNA. We get our polysaccharides, etc. And then the genetic material encodes for proteins, and lipids are going to start to form these spheres. And then we get the formation of a protocell, which is a self-replicating system enclosed in a membrane. And so this happened in a stepwise manner. In the 1920s, A. Operin and J.B.S. Haldane hypothesis was this primordial soup hypothesis, which was proposed. Early Earth had very little oxygen because most of the chemicals present after the Earth cooled were highly reactive with oxygen. It instead contained water vapor, hydrogen gas, methane, and ammonia. Methane and ammonia are better reducing agents in the absence of oxygen. Remember that for our redox reactions, we have oxidation is going to be a loss of electrons, and reduction is going to be a gain of electrons. And so early Earth had a reducing atmosphere in which redox reactions could have driven the abiotic synthesis of organic monomers from inorganic molecules in the presence of strong energy sources. Abiotic means without life. And so these redox reactions could have formed these monomers. Stanley Miller and Harold Urey in 1953 performed a famous experiment to test this primordial soup hypothesis. And so they proposed that energy sources included heat from volcanoes, radioactivity from isotopes, electrical discharges from lightning, and solar radiation. And so these energy sources mixed with these chemicals was enough to make early monomers. And so Miller placed a mixture of methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water in a closed system. So to mimic what they believed early life on Earth to be like. And he heated the mixture and provided an electrical spark. And what he found was that after a week's run, he discovered that amino acids and other organic acids had been produced. So even in the absence of any living cells, there were still able to form these amino acids by this type of chemical reaction. And so they basically tried to mimic early Earth's atmosphere and then see if they could get these organic molecules as a result. And what they found was that they could. They got these amino acids and other organic acids simply from this collection of gases and a energy source. Now, once we start to make our monomers, then we have to start to see the evolution of polymers. And so researchers have brought about the polymerization of monomers to form polymers such as proteins and nucleic acids by dripping solutions of organic monomers onto hot sand, clay, or rock. And it's believed that clay or iron pyrite might have catalyzed the first synthesis reaction. And so notice when you look at this diagram, here we have our clay surface and it has these iron pyrites, and this creates a charge on the surface of the clay that is going to be positively charged. So what they believe is that these adenine nucleotides, for example, these nucleotides, remember, have a negative charge because of the phosphate groups. And so these adenine nucleotides, the negative charges on the nucleotides are attracted to the positive charge in the clay. And what happens is we start to get covalent bonds among the backbone of that nucleic acid. So we're going to link the sugar phosphate backbone. Those adenines then attracted uracil, so for RNA. So wherever we had A's, then the U's were attracted. And then those U's were linked again by a covalent bond, so forming that phosphodiester bond between the sugar and the phosphate. And that then led to this double-stranded molecule of nucleic acids. And so after we have basically the evolution of monomers, then we start to see the evolution of polymers, putting those monomers together to start to form those polymers. The next step in the formation of life would be the formation of pre-cells, these protocells. And so we have our monomers produced, we have our polymers produced. Now we need to start to put them together. And so a key step in the origin of life was the isolation of a collection of abiotically created molecules. So again, abiotic means without life, that were formed within a membrane. And laboratory experiments demonstrate that these pre-cells could have formed spontaneously from abiotic produced by organic compounds. And so these could form spontaneously without living cells. And such pre-cells produced in the laboratory display some lifelike properties. They have a selectively permeable surface, so that membrane is going to be selectively permeable. They can grow by absorbing molecules from their surroundings. And they can swell or shrink when placed in different salt concentrations, because those different salt concentrations can either create outside the cell a hypertonic or a hypotonic environment, which is going to cause the cell to either gain weight or gain water or lose water. And so we can have these formation of these pre-cells. This phospholipid can form, these lipids can form around the polymers that have been created, like the nucleic acids. And then we start to see the origin of self-replicating molecules. And the first type of self-replicating molecule was believed to be RNA. And so there was this RNA first hypothesis, which was the belief that only RNA would be needed to progress towards the formation of the first cell. And the discovery of catalytic RNAs in the 1980s supports this hypothesis. And that's because these types of RNA not only function as genetic information, but they also, in certain cases for RNAs, can act as enzymes to speed up chemical reactions. And so ribozymes are RNA molecules that function both as a genetic substrate and as an enzyme. And so if RNA evolved first, it could function as both the genes and the enzyme. It could do both originally. And so life can be said to begin with the origin of molecules that are capable of variable self-replication. So once you start to get these self-replicating molecules, then you can start to see life forming. And so we ended up with different life forms because once you have self-replicating cells, for example, then you can start to have evolution occurring because of mutation, which then leads to differences between cells, and you end up with new populations of cells. So it was not enough for molecules to just make copies of themselves. These copies had to differ from one another, such that some would be better suited for their environment than others. With this, Darwinian natural selection could have acted on these molecules, thus setting in motion the evolution that would ultimately result in today's diverse living world. And so again, once we start to get mutations, we get changes in DNA sequences, then we can start to have these differences that can be selected for by natural selection. So, question for you. The first reproduction on Earth may have been blank. Is it red eukaryotic cells, yellow RNA molecules, green bacteria, blue DNA molecules, or purple silicon-based life forms? So pause your video and when you're ready, push play to hear the answer. So if you said yellow RNA molecules, you are correct. These are self-replicating molecules. So because these RNA molecules, these ribozymes, can function both as nucleic acid and as an enzyme, these were the first self-replicating, the first type of reproduction that was found on Earth. So now we're going to look at the tree of life. And so every living thing on Earth belongs to one of three domains of life. We have bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. All members of domains bacteria and archaea are single-celled microbes. No bacteria or archaeal cell has a nucleus, which makes bacteria and archaea prokaryotes, right? They lack that membrane-bound nucleus. In contrast, all organisms in the domain eukarya are composed of one or more cells that have a nucleus, which means that all members of this domain are eukaryotes. And so classically, domain eukarya is composed of 4 kingdoms: plants, animals, fungi, protists. Now remember that protists was classically thought of as one kingdom. However, scientists have been going into kingdom protists and starting to break it down further and divide it into separate kingdoms. And so we're going to look at how these different life forms evolved on Earth. So this is just showing you this tree of life, and you've probably seen this by now. So again, life is divided into our 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, eukarya. Bacteria and archaea, those are going to be our prokaryotic cells. Domain eukarya are going to be our eukaryotic cells. And so within kingdom protists, we can have our amoeba, our dinoflagellates, our parameciums, our diatoms, etc. Kingdom plantae, we'll talk about different types of plants. Flowering plants, what are called angiosperms. Conifers, cone-bearing plants, or the evergreens. Ferns, mosses, etc. In kingdom Animalia, we can have our vertebrates, which have a vertebrae, and our invertebrates, which lack a vertebrae. So jellyfish, snail, etc. And so you guys learned about this in your first lab when we looked at the diversity of life. And then lastly, we have kingdom fungi. And kingdom fungi, these are heterotrophs. They are other feeders. They have to consume food like animals. And when we look within kingdom fungi, it can be broken down into 3 groups: molds, mushrooms, and yeast. Molds and mushrooms are going to be multicellular fungi, and yeast is going to be unicellular fungi. And so they can exist either as multicelled or unicellular organisms. So we're going to look at kind of how organisms evolved over time. And so we're going to start with a long first period, which is going to be the Precambrian period. And so the earliest evidence we have for life is a chemical signature of it, which is carbon utilization, the usage of carbon. And that is recorded as rocks that are found in Greenland to have dated back to about 3.8 billion years ago. And so these internal patterns of sedimentary rock formations known as stromatolites, dating from 3.4 billion years ago, tell us that life was abundant by that point. And all of this life was bacterial or archaeal, and all of it appears to have existed in the ocean. And so the earliest life forms were aquatic. Photosynthesis was first performed by bacteria approximately 2.7 billion years ago. This was a critical event because photosynthesis provides the food that supports almost all life on Earth. The other big thing about photosynthesis is that photosynthesis, remember, also produces oxygen. And so oxygen came to exist in significant quantity in the Earth's atmosphere through the activity of cyanobacteria. And these cyanobacteria produce oxygen as a byproduct of photosynthesis. And this started to accumulate in the atmosphere about 2.4 billion years ago. This increase in atmospheric oxygen levels was important because organisms that metabolize food through oxygen-aided means can extract much more energy from a given quantity of food than can organisms that lack this aerobic capacity. You might recall when we talked about metabolism that aerobic cellular respiration gives us about 30 to 32 ATP per glucose, whereas if we look at fermentation, which is an anaerobic process, fermentation only gives us 2 ATP per glucose. So, adapting to oxygen, again, our mitochondria originally were believed to have been bacteria that could metabolize oxygen, right? This is our endosymbiotic theory. And the bacteria benefited from the eukaryotic cell's machinery, and the eukaryotic cell benefited from the bacteria's ability to metabolize oxygen. Early eukaryotes benefited from the rise in atmospheric oxygen after being invaded by and then continuing to live in symbiosis with bacteria that were able to metabolize oxygen. A later bacterial invasion allowed one variety of eukaryotes, the algae, to then also perform photosynthesis. So, question for you. The first organisms to produce oxygen approximately 2.7 billion years ago were red Protista, yellow cyanobacteria, green algae, blue land plants, purple archaea. Pause your video when you're ready, push play. If you said yellow cyanobacteria, you are correct. All of the others, so the protists, the algae, and the land plants, did not exist 2.7 billion years ago because we did not have eukaryotic cells yet. So we know it has to be of prokaryotic cell origin, and so cyanobacteria would be the ones that can do photosynthesis. The archaea do not. So the answer is cyanobacteria. So next we're going to look at the Cambrian explosion. And so the fossil record indicates a tremendous rapid expansion of the number of animals that formed during this Cambrian explosion. And this began about 542 million years ago. So we have these trilobites and these other types of life forms that had evolved during this Cambrian explosion. So we are now going to talk about the movement onto land. So plants were the first to make the transition from aquatic to land. So plants evolved from green algae, and they made a gradual transition to land in tandem with their symbiotic partners, the fungi. The plants provided the fungi with food through photosynthesis, and the fungi provided plants with water and mineral absorption through their filamentous extensions. And so they would live in harmony with the plants, the fungus would. And because the fungus has all of these little extensions, these hyphae, that is basically going to increase surface area. And remember in lab, we talked about that the higher the surface area to volume ratio, the faster the rate of diffusion. So by having this fungi, this mold, for example, this fungus that basically has these hyphae, that is going to increase surface area, which is going to allow the plant to get better water absorption. And so you can see on this time scale here, plants moved onto land about 475 million years ago. Green algae were once classified as being a protist, but green algae was actually moved into being classified as a plant. Red algae and brown algae are still within kingdom Protista, but green algae is now a plant. And so green algae evolved to be able to live on land. About 400 million years ago, we see the origin of vascular tissue. So if you remember back to our diversity of life, the earliest form of plants that moved onto land were the bryophytes, right? Those are our mosses. And remember that our mosses grow low to the ground because they lack a vascular tissue. However, about 400 million years ago, we start to see the origin of vascular tissue. And that is when we started to see the ferns. Then later we get the origin of pollen and seeds. So our conifers, right, our gymnosperms evolved about 300 million years ago. And then we see the origin of flowering plants about 130 million years ago. So adaptations made life on dry land possible about 475 million years ago, which is the age of the oldest known plant fossils. And so major transitions in plant life came about with the development of a water-retaining covering, which we call the cuticle. That waxy covering helps to keep water in. Embryos that mature inside of a parent plant, and a vascular or fluid transporting system. And so if we compare algae to plants, if we look at algae are surrounded by water, and the whole algae is going to perform photosynthesis. It's going to absorb water, carbon dioxide, and mineral. However, land plants evolved to have these different parts, and these different parts carry out different functions. So we can have, in the example of an angiosperm or a flowering plant, we can have a flower. This is our reproductive structure, and that is going to be it's going to be there to help attract pollinators, which is going to help carry on the plant life cycle. The leaves are going to perform photosynthesis. The cuticle is going to reduce water loss. The stomata, those pores on the underside of the leaf, are going to be used for gas exchange. The shoot system supports the plant and may perform photosynthesis. And then the roots of the plant are going to anchor the plant and absorb water and minerals from the soil, often aided by fungi as well. So mosses are the earliest evolving group of plants that are still alive, what we call the bryophytes. Again, these plants are going to be non-vascular and seedless. So if we look at our mosses, notice that they have to grow low to the ground and they have to grow near water. The reason that they have to grow low to the ground is because they lack a vascular system. They don't have that vascular system to transport water over long distances. The way that they get water is by simple diffusion. So they need to grow low to the ground and they need to be in close proximity to water in order to get water to do photosynthesis. And so those early plants also did not use seeds for reproduction, they used spores. About 425 million years ago, plants evolved to have a vascular system, which allowed them to grow much taller. And so these include the ferns, which would be the next plants that evolved. And these are plants that evolved to have a vascular system, but still lack seeds. We still don't see the evolution of seeds yet. Later plants went on to develop seeds about 380 million years ago, which can be thought of as packages containing the embryo and the food for it encased in a tough outer covering. And so the seed is there to kind of help protect that developing embryo. The living descendants of the first seed plants are going to be the gymnosperms, which are represented today by our conifers or our cone-bearing plants. And so if we look, here is a female cone, and the female cone is going to have scales, and those scales are going to contain the female gametophyte. If we look at the male cones produce pollen, and they make the male gametophytes. And so we have both male and female cones, and the female cones are going to contain the seeds. And for the cone-bearing plants, they have a little wing on them to help with seed dispersal. The flowering plants, what we call angiosperms, developed between 180 and 140 million years ago and eventually succeeded the gymnosperms as the most dominant plants on Earth. Today, angiosperms include many food crops, grasses, cacti, and tree varieties. They are pretty much everywhere. And so they were the last to evolve. And so that's because they still had a vascular system. They had seeds, but now we start to see the evolution of flowers and fruit. Flowers are to attract pollinators so that we can pollinate between different plants. Fruit is an advantage because animals will eat the fruit, right? The fruit tastes good to the animals. Animals will eat the fruit. Remember that the seeds are going to be in the fruit, and the seeds are the embryos. Animals are mobile. So animal eats the fruit, which eats the seeds. Animal moves to a new location. Animal defecates. It goes poo, essentially. That is going to then go into the earth in a new location because the animal has moved, and that is going to help with seed dispersal. So this is just showing you the evolution of plants. So again, green algae were the first plants to start to migrate onto land to acquire terrestrial adaptations about 475 million years ago. Then we see our bryophytes. And our bryophytes, remember, are the mosses. They are non-vascular. They lack a vascular system. This is why they have to grow low to the ground. Then we start to see the evolution of ferns. And our ferns and other seedless vascular plants still don't use seeds. They use spores for reproduction, but they do have a vascular system, which is what allows ferns to grow quite tall. Then we start to see the origin of our gymnosperms. And our gymnosperms are now going to still have a vascular system, but now we start to see the evolution of seeds. And the seeds are going to be contained within the cone. About 140 million years ago, we start to see the evolution of flowering plants. So our angiosperms are vascular. They have seeds, right? Because they're the latest in terms of evolutionary history. They have all the same things as the earlier ones. But now the angiosperms have evolved to have flowers and fruit. So that was their adaptation. And so this is kind of how plants have evolved over time. So question for you. Ferns are plants that have red vascular tissue but no seeds. Yellow, no vascular tissue, but reproduce with seeds. Green, vascular tissue and reproduce with seeds. Blue, no vascular tissue and no seeds. Or purple, none of the above. So think about your answer, pause your video, and when you're ready, go ahead and push play. So if you said red, you are correct. They have vascular tissue. That's why they're able to grow tall, but they do not yet have seeds. They didn't evolve to have seeds yet. The first ones to have seeds would be the gymnosperms. So no vascular tissue, but reproduce with seeds. None of them fall in that category. If they have seeds, they also have a vascular tissue because the vascular tissue evolved before seeds. Vascular tissue and reproduce with seeds, that would be either our gymnosperms or the angiosperms would both fall into that category. No vascular tissue and no seeds, these would be our bryophytes or our mosses. So once plants had migrated onto land or evolved to live on land, animals then followed plants onto land. So the first land animals were the arthropods. A centipede-like creature laid down the oldest terrestrial animal tracks that we know of about 440 million years ago. And insects soon followed in great abundance. And the evolution of flight sparked an explosion in terms of insect variety. And the arthropods were the only land animals for millions of years thereafter. And so you might recall back to our diversity of life lab, the arthropods can be broken down into they have a exoskeleton and jointed appendages. So we have our arachnids or our spiders, we have our crustaceans or our crabs, we have millipedes and centipedes, we have insects like butterflies. So arthropods were the first to occupy land. Now, one group of fish, the lobe-finned fish, gave rise to the four-limbed vertebrates, which we now call tetrapods. Tetra means four. And they moved onto land about 380 to 370 million years ago. And so these lobe-finned fish then gave rise to these early amphibians. And so the tetrapods gave rise to the amphibians, which are represented today by frogs and salamanders, etc. Amphibians inhabit two worlds, both water and land, in keeping with their close evolutionary relationship with animals that live strictly in water. So they have part of their life cycle in the water, the tadpole stage, and they have part of their life cycle on land. And so amphibians came into existence about 350 million years ago. Amphibians in turn gave rise to reptiles. And reptiles evolved to have a protective amniotic egg that allowed their offspring to develop away from water, which freed reptiles to start to migrate inland, which the frogs can't do because the frogs need to be close to the water. But because the reptiles lay an egg, and that egg has a protective shell on it, that helps to keep the eggs from drying out, and they don't have to be in water. And so birds are the living descendants of the reptile branch that includes the dinosaurs. All mammals then evolved from reptiles. Mammals appeared as a group of small insect-eating animals about 200 million years ago. These animals fed their young on milk derived from special female mammary glands, hence the name mammals. They feed their young with mammary glands. They also possess fur coats over their skins, which is an important feature for animals restricted to feeding at night when the dinosaurs were less active. So it gave them an advantage to have that fur coat to keep them warm when they were nocturnal. So this is just showing you the evolutionary history of terrestrial vertebrates. So we have our first to move on to land would be our amphibians. So we have our lobe-finned fish, which then evolved and gave rise to the amphibians, and the amphibians were able to move on to land. Then we saw the evolution of an amniotic egg that allowed the reptiles to move away from water. Then we get from the reptiles, they branch off into the dinosaurs, which are closely related to the birds, so they're of the same lineage. And the reptiles also branched from the mammals, and the characteristic that separates them is that the mammals evolved to have mammary glands and hair. And so they acquire these different types of adaptations, which allow them to have unique features that make them better adapted for their environment. So contemporary research indicates that all of today's basic forms of animals, all of the modern mammalian orders, had evolved by 75 million years ago, some 10 million years prior to the demise of the dinosaurs in the Cretaceous extinction. Another round of mammalian speciation began about 10 million years after the dinosaurs died out. And so thus, contrary to a long-standing assumption, the demise of dinosaurs seemed to have no effect on the evolution of modern mammals, We had quite a bit that were prior to the dinosaurs and another big event after the dinosaurs. The order of mammals that are called primates have fossils that date from 55 million years ago. These organisms are characterized by large front-facing eyes, limbs with an opposable first digit, which would be thumbs in human beings today, and a tree-dwelling existence, which some later arriving primates then lost. So if we look at the evolution of primates, we have our earliest tree-dwelling existence. We have our tree shoe. We then have the evolution of binocular vision, so the eyes facing forward, and the opposable digits. We have the prosimians. We have then those branch from into the New World monkeys and then the Old World monkeys. And then we start to see the evolution of the loss of tree-dwelling existence. So they don't live in the trees anymore. So now we have our orangutans and our gorillas. And again, chimpanzees are going to be the most closely related in terms of the primates to humans. We share a lot of our DNA sequence with chimpanzees. So this is just showing you some different types of primate mammals. So we have on the left here, we have this loris from India. You can see a lot of diversity in basically how they compare to what we look like. Here we have a woolly spider monkey in Brazil. Here we have a lowland silverback gorilla in Africa. And so these are just some different primates that have evolved over time. Which of the following is true of mammals? Red, mammals first evolved after the extinction of dinosaurs. Yellow, birds are more closely related to mammals than they are to reptiles. Green, the first mammals to evolve were aquatic. Blue, humans and other primates hunted small dinosaurs. Or purple, early mammals were small insect eaters. And so the answer is purple. Early mammals were small insect eaters. So the early mammals were small insect eaters. So red said mammals first evolved after the extinction of dinosaurs. That is not true. There were about 10 million mammal species prior to the extinction of dinosaurs. Birds are more closely related to mammals than they are to reptiles. No, birds are more closely related to reptiles. Green, the first mammals to evolve were aquatic. That's not true. They were on land. Blue, humans and other primates hunted small dinosaurs. That is not true because humans evolved millions of years after the dinosaurs had become extinct. So the answer is purple. Early mammals were small insect eaters. And so this concludes our very brief intro to the history of life on Earth.